I've got a very cool war story to tell you about today. It's about the Battle of Norway in World War II, which I'm sure you're thinking, that all sounds very interesting. But you don't know the Norwegians. They're not just famous for Vikings and grey hand cream and beards. They've even got cool words for banana. Apparently it's buljaj. Goj. That was my Norwegian word of the day, which probably wasn't even Norwegian. Anyhow, it also so happens at the Battle of Norway, the very first Victoria Cross in World War II was won. That all sets the scene for the second part of the video, which is about 3 Germans and 2 British soldiers crashed in the mountains of Norway during this period, who had to rely on each other to survive. And they were so good, in fact, that they made a film about it called Into the White, which had Harry Potter's friend, Ron Weasley, in it, Rupert Grint. Before I tell you all about that though, this is a sponsored video, as you've probably seen from the description, so I need to tell you about that first. The game is of course World of Warships, if you've never seen this before. It is completely free, as World of Tanks is. They've given me this account for a couple of days so I could get some footage with this ship, which is the Admiral Hipper, because this is one of the ships that's in the story. I also did play a bit with the Bismarck, because I kind of like how the Bismarck looks. Couldn't find a more fitting game for this commentary, I don't think, because I think the ships are 100% or very close to historically accurate. Very strategic as well, as you'd imagine naval warfare would be. Like, if you get yourself out of position, get yourself sunk very quickly in this. But anyway, in the description, there's 7 days premium, 1 million credits, 250 doubloons, and a free ship for the first 500 people. So, if you use that code, well, it's there for you. So, Norway, at the start of World War II, was neutral. But unfortunately, the Germans had an eye on them because they've got incredibly good reserves of iron ore, and iron ore was one of the most important things for any of the countries in World War II to have. With iron ore, not only can you put it in a blast furnace and melt it down into iron, but you can also convert it to steel for your battleships and your tanks and the rest. And it was in that short supply that in America, who you'd think have loads of resources, people had to like donate the bumpers off their cars, bottoms of shopping trolleys and stuff, just for enough iron for the military to actually build weapons with. It all began with the Altmark incident though. The Altmark was a German ship travelling in Norwegian waters with a Norwegian escort, but on board they had 300 Allied prisoners from an Allied ship that had sank. The British saw this, intercepted the Altmark, boarded it, killed 7 Germans and released all the prisoners. Understandably, Hitler wasn't very happy. There's this quote by Machiavelli which says, "Humans should either be treated generously or destroyed, for they take revenge for slight injuries, for heavy ones they cannot." And on reading this, I knew nothing about the Battle of Norway up until about 2-3 days ago. I swear this applies directly to this. Like, the Altmark was like a slight injury to Hitler. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, just wanted to still just contain Germany, which is why he was eventually replaced by Winston Churchill, who wanted to actually take direct action to stop Germany. And had that actually happened, then perhaps Norway wouldn't have been invaded. What Hitler actually did was he began Operation, oh my goodness, Vesrebung, which I apologise if you German listened to that. That must have been terrible. But honestly, like the umlauts, the little 2 dots on U's, they just look like a smiley face to me. How am I meant to pronounce a smiley face? But yeah, Hitler invaded basically with 100,000 troops, 30 destroyers, and a couple of panzer divisions on the ground. Despite the heavy rain, choppy seas and fog, British plane reconnaissance managed to spot the Germans setting up for this, so they sent out their own fleet into the sea around Norway to intercept the German fleet. Unfortunately, because of the bad weather, one of the British ships, HMS Glowworm, suffered a sailor overboard. He got knocked over by a wave, and turning around a big ship like that is not exactly a quick job. So HMS Glowworm ended up trailing massively behind the rest of the fleet. This is where, despite having a very cool name for a ship, things started to go bad for Glowworm. As it was trying to catch up with the other ships which had gone ahead, it spotted 2 German destroyers coming from the east, flanking the whole of the British fleet. Glowworm instantly fired on these 2 destroyers, hitting one of them and causing them to retreat, which you might think is a little strange given it's a 2v1 at this point. But they were trying to lure Glowworm back to their capital ships, which sounds like something out of Star Wars, except in this situation, the Empire wins. Now the commander of the Glowworm, Lieutenant Commander Roop, he knew that this was a trap. He also knew that whatever was over the horizon, the Glowworm would stand no chance against. But he had to go and intercept those 2 German destroyers because they're in such a dangerous flanking position to the rest of the British fleet, and he couldn't tell the rest of the British fleet that this was the case because they were enforcing radio silence, ironically so the Germans wouldn't know where they were. This ended up with the glowworm running into the heavy German cruiser Admiral Hipper. Now, as you can probably imagine, a heavy cruiser is bigger than a destroyer like glowworm was, but this is exactly how much bigger. The glowworm was roughly 1,400 tons. The Admiral Hipper was 16,000 tons. The German ship had 200mm cannons on it. That later started firing at the glowworm, who only had 120mm cannons. 8,000 yards, that's 7 kilometers away, it started shelling glowworm. You can actually see the difference in size here. This is a shot from the Admiral Hipper's deck onto the glowworm. It's not actually on fire there, it's used a smoke screen. They use this to like block off line of sight in World War II. Unfortunately, the Admiral Hipper's guns were radar based, so that smoke screen actually made no difference whatsoever, but it does show you how heavily outgunned glowworm was. Now, before the Admiral Hipper managed to get that close to the glowworm, it had already hit it several times with its main guns. It had destroyed the radio room, the bridge, the forward guns were out of action. Basically, all the glowworm had was its torpedo tubes, which it tried to use on the Hipper, but as you can see from that, the Hipper's advancing like bow forwards intentionally, so it's more difficult for it to get hit by torpedoes. Just before it popped that smoke, another salvo from the Hipper severed the ship's mast, destroyed the wiring, and it actually caused the ship's siren on the glowworm to just wail constantly on as it disappeared back into that smoke. And this is actually what Roop won the Victoria Cross for. As the Admiral Hipper passed through the smoke to try and find and finish off the glowworm, Roop ordered the one thing that they could do left. They had no torpedoes, no main guns. He ordered that the glowworm ram into the side of the Hipper. The Hipper had no time to react. The collision ripped 50 meters worth of armor off the side of the Hipper, caused it to take on over 500 tons of water and list massively to the side. Unfortunately, the damage to the glowworm was far more severe though, and 10 minutes later the ship's boilers exploded, killing 109 of the crew. Fortunately, the Hipper was commanded by a very well respected German captain called Helmuth Hay, who turned back to pick up the few crewmen who'd survived that. Roop drowned assisting the other survivors before they could get to him. And Hay, he actually wrote to the British Ministry of Defence requesting that Roop be awarded the Victoria Cross, because he realised how brave the crew of the glowworm had actually been to take on such a much larger and powerful ship like the Hipper. The even more unfortunate thing is though, the sinking of the glowworm had a much larger effect on the battle for Norway, because a lot of the British ships, due to the partial radio silence, didn't quite know what had gone on to sink the glowworm, thought there was a massive German fleet there, and turned to go and intercept it. The German fleet wasn't actually there, and it let them sail free into one of Norway's largest ports called Narvik. The only thing defending Narvik was 2 old and inexperienced Norwegian coastal defence ships, which after a quick parley with the Germans preemptively fired upon and destroyed. And seeing this and knowing that they would be shelled to oblivion, the Norwegian coastal forces gave them the town without a fight. By this time, the Admiral Hipper had managed to repair some of the damage that the glowworm had done and made it to its objective, which was the Norwegian port of Trondheim. When it got there, with an incredibly lucky shot from one of its cannons, it managed to destroy the power cable powering all of the floodlights looking out over the sea so the Norwegian coastal batteries could actually hit the ships. As it was night time, this made the batteries entirely useless, and Trondheim fell very quickly. The Germans were also using captured radio codes from Narvik to confuse the coastal batteries at other ports as to who to shoot at. Some of the Norwegians realised this though, including those at Oscarsborg Fortress, who let one of the German destroyers, Blucher, sail within 200 metres of the guns before unleashing a full salvo straight into its side, not missing a shot. The Blucher sank that fast that the other German ships following it thought it had hit a massive minefield, and that actually delayed the German advance enough for the Norwegian royal family and parliament to escape to Britain. Unfortunately though, this was still just a delay to the inevitable, and German, even though the Norwegians held out in some areas for I think the longest of any country that was taken over by Germans, I think it was a full 62 days, but after Norway had been taken, the Germans just walked straight into Denmark, took it I believe in 2 days. The Danish people literally woke up one morning, looked out of their window and marching down the street with German soldiers. They didn't even realise that they were going to be invaded. We still haven't covered the story that this video is about though, surviving with the enemy. And I told you all of that because this story took place during those 62 days where the Germans had landed and the Norwegians were still trying to fight them. So Captain Partridge and his gunner Lieutenant Bostock were flying in a 3-plane squadron of Blackburn Skuas, which I believe is actually named after a seagull. I think it was a Skua seagull. But they were flying in those and they spotted a Heinkel bomber, which they proceeded to shoot down, killing the tail gunner. Unfortunately, their engine then failed, and they ended up crashing down onto a frozen lake in the middle of the Norwegian wilderness. And at that point of year in April, we're talking about 1 metre of snow. Bear Grylls love this kind of survival kind of Norway. They survived the landing because the lake's like a nice flat landing ground. Scuttle, I guess it's not called scuttles for players, but they fired a flare cartridge into the fuel tank and obviously burnt out the plane because they didn't want their Germans getting hands on their technology. And in fact, you can actually go and see this exact plane. It's held at the Fleet Air Arms Museum in Somerset in the UK. Because after the lake obviously melted, the plane sank into it, but then they went back and retrieved it, and it's held there, the exact plane. Been see, it's really quite interesting. Obviously at this point their first thought wasn't, this is going to make a great museum exhibit, but they needed to get out of the snow because terrible weather and they weren't going to survive out there long. They saw on the top of a hill an old reindeer's hut, so they went up into that and set up a fire. 10 minutes later they heard German voices outside, which obviously was a little bit disconcerting. They looked out the window. Advancing up the hill towards their hut was 3 German pilots from the Heinkel bomber, pistols and knives in hand. Through shouting broken English and German out of the hut, they managed to persuade the Germans that they were actually the pilots of a different Wellington bomber that had crashed, because they obviously didn't want the Germans to realise that they just shot them down. Having sat together around the fire for a bit, out the window down the other side of the hill, they saw an old abandoned hotel. Partridge decided that the Germans should sleep in the hut and they would go and set up their camp in there, because obviously they didn't really want to be going to sleep when the enemy was right next to them. In the morning, the British and the Germans met up. They had to get out of this situation. Partridge and one of the Germans decided to head off in one direction round the back of the hotel to see what they could find, and then Bostock stayed with the other 2. About 5 minutes later, Bostock heard a shot. He drew out his pistol and rushed round to where he'd last seen Partridge, convinced that the German had shot him. Turns out it wasn't the German, but Partridge had run into a Norwegian ski patrol who'd fired a warning shot over their heads. Partridge was laid flat in the ground, and the German was stood there shouting English to the Norwegians. One of the Norwegians turned around and the German made for his pistol but was shot by one of the other Norwegian ski patrol members. Relations at this point became a little bit strained because now the Norwegians thought that they were trying to kill them and wouldn't believe that Partridge and Bostock were actually British. It just so happened, out of another massive amount of luck, that one of the Norwegians was Partridge's friend's brother-in-law. The Norwegians took them to the nearby town of Andelsnes, which is probably not how you say that either. But Partridge and Bostock were very fortunate in that they managed to catch a ride on the HMS Manchester back to Britain before Norway fell. What happened to the 2 remaining Germans though? They both got transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Canada, which they spent the remainder of the war in. And after that, one of them, about 20 years later, called Horst Schopsis, wrote his memoirs, which Partridge happened to read. They met up and became good friends. I think this is the second story I've actually read where that's the case, but yeah, I thought that was quite a nice ending to that. But yeah, that's the end of this story. I hope you found it interesting, because I find it interesting anyway. Also, if you do try out World of Warships, make sure to use that code in the description, because it's not a referral code, but it does give you that extra stuff and it's worth putting it in. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video guys, and I shall see you in the next chapter.